I'm joined today by Dr. Cate Shanahan MD, whose mission is to help every athlete and person who wants to achieve better health and their full potential. She specializes in diagnosing metabolic imbalances that cause fatigue, impair performance, and promote injuries. She brings out the inner athlete in all her patients in the pursuit of optimal body composition, disease reversal, and enhanced physical performance. She's worked as science consultant for the LA Lakers Pro Nutrition program since 2012, and Dr. Cate is among the most trusted voices in sport nutrition science. Her most recent book, Deep Nutrition: Why Your Genes Need Traditional Food, makes the case that our body's nutritional needs are not as complex as we are often led to believe. There is one diet that's good for everything, from improving strength and performance to reversing heart disease and diabetes, and good for everyone of every age. Dr. Cate, thank you so much for taking the time out today.
Thanks for having me on your show, Dr. Mark. This is fun.
Terrific. Well, listen, I'm a big fan of your work as a physician, as a nutritionist, and your new book, Deep Nutrition, is really insightful, very eloquently written, and I think it'd be great if we can kick things off talking about DNA. And there's one quote from your book that really stuck out to me, and I'll read it quickly here. The DNA from our cells, strung end to end, would reach to the moon and back at least 5,000 times. But our genes make up only 2% of it. The rest of it is junk. Now, can you set the stage for listeners and explain this?
Yeah, so their DNA is in every single one of our cells, right? It's the molecules that direct the cell to do everything. So a lot of times when we think about DNA, we just talk about, okay, well, we have to pass our genes on to our children. So we just think about, the gonads and the ovaries and stuff like that. But it's also in every single cell in our body. And that's like mostly, a big part of what it does is it directs the cell's activity. And so that massive amount, that massive length of the DNA is all of the DNA in all of the cells in our body. Just to give you an idea of like how much there is in terms of information packed into your body.
It's mind-boggling, right?
Entirety. Yeah, it's really incredible, and it's so beyond just the sum total. Even what happens in any single cell is amazing when you break it down and start to look at it and think about all of it. So, and we can talk about like what is the rest of that 98%.
Exactly.
Doing? What's it doing there? What is it? So when we say genes, we mean the part of the DNA that codes for protein, and the rest of the DNA does a lot of other stuff around deciding when each one of those protein coding sections should be allowed to be translated into the protein, right? So it's not like there's protein in our DNA. It's sections of our DNA that have instructions for making protein. So like, let's say it's a hair follicle, right? So the major parts of that hair follicle that make protein are going to be actually for physically making hair. So there's all kinds of enzymes involved in making that molecule of keratin, which is the kind of protein our hair is made out of. And so that particular kind of cell will be mostly making that kind of protein. But then there's a lot of other proteins that the cell has to make just to maintain its daily function, produce energy, and to decide when it's time to divide. That's a big decision point, a big thing that every cell has to do too. It has to decide if it's time to divide or time to keep on living the way it was. So that 98% makes those decisions. So it's called junk because in our typical 1950s fashion, so some of this stuff this term came out of the 1950s, like in our whole better living through chemistry, we know better than nature mindset. If we didn't understand what something did, we just assumed it was like leftover trash. It didn't do anything.
Not that we didn't understand it.
Yeah, if we didn't understand it, it couldn't be important. So that 98% actually is extremely important because it is what makes the 2% come alive. It interacts with the outside world. It interacts with the food that you eat, with the water you drink, with the air you breathe, and it's what, when stress affects your cells and affects your body, it's affecting your cells' function through that 98%. That's not junk. And we now call it like regulatory DNA, and we have other names for it. But it's extremely complicated. And it's too complicated for anyone to even codify or understand at this point. So it's not something we want to take guesses about. And that's why the only reason I'm bringing that up is not to say that, we're going to be trying to engineer it. And the whole point is the idea that we could engineer it is absurd. It's magical thinking. And yet we are still at the NIH and, all the leading institutions in this country laboring under the delusion that we're going to be able to modify our gene function in a way, a substantial way to prevent disease. That's just not how it's going to work. It's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. And they've been spending billions and billions of dollars and remain unconvinced by their constant failures that that's not the correct thing to be doing. We should be doing is realizing that when it comes to health, nutrition, biology, new is not better. New and is not improved. Old is what got us here, and we really better understand what got us here before there's no one around who knows what we used to do in terms of what got us here, which was our cooking and culinary tradition. So that's why the subtitle of our book is Why Your Genes Need Traditional Food, because that is the body of science we should be paying attention to.
Very, very well said. And you talk about how, our lifestyle teaches our genes how to behave. Can good nutrition reverse bad genes?
So it can reverse bad gene function. And can it reverse bad genes? Well, maybe not, but not in your generation, unfortunately. So, bad genes, I should clarify, is that 2% of DNA that have a mutation in them that causes disease. So that's a kind of, I guess, a good definition of what is a bad gene. Mm-hmm. But because technically our genes also, depending who you ask, right? So some people will say genes are just the protein coding segments and the rest is regulatory DNA and you shouldn't call it genes. But everyone does, right? Except for geneticists. So just to clarify what we're talking about, the protein coding sections are technically correctly called genes, and that is what we were studying almost exclusively until very recently, is those genes. So most of the disease-causing genes are in that 2%. Now, much more recently, we've been able to do massive different types of sequencing and understand the rest of the DNA, right? Just because the sheer quantity of it was difficult to sequence the rest of it. The rest of it now we're better able to find anomalies, and so these are the tests that when people get their DNA sent off to certain gene testing companies, some of them are also testing these regulatory segments, because we now are understanding that there's DNA mutations in regulatory segments that also cause disease. So those DNA mutations, though, are workaroundable in some cases, right? So even if you have a DNA mutation in a protein coding segment, well, maybe you only have one of the two copies of your DNA with that mutation, right? So the body sometimes can make do with the other copy functioning. And the better your diet, the better you allow everything in your cell to work, the more likely you'll do well, even if you have one bad copy. So a perfect example is sickle cell. People with sickle cell anemia can have one copy of the sickle cell trait. So sickle cell disease is mostly in African Americans because it enabled people to be resistant to malaria. And for much of our history as humans, we were all living in Africa. And so malaria was a big deal, and not dying from it was a big deal. So the sickle cell gene actually gave some people with the trait an advantage, because the the red blood cells are abnormally shaped, and they just basically clog up the little nozzle of the mosquito nose, so he can't he
Can't
won't
get at it.
Yeah, yeah. So he's not going to give you any diseases either. So sickle trait has a tendency to have some abnormal shaped cells only when you're maybe stressed or sick. And then, so most of your life, if you have the sickle trait, you can do perfectly well. But if you have sickle cell disease, you'll have these sickle cell crises from time to time where the abnormally shaped cells, or the red blood cells have a tendency to become abnormally shaped. And then they clot in your arteries and stuff like that. And you have what's called a sickle cell crisis. And so if you only have the trait, that hardly ever happens. But so now we're talking about, like, what if you only have the trait? Well, if you have a healthy diet and your body is tougher, you're more able to resist things that happen to bring out a crisis. And this is an issue actually in the NFL, because the sickle cell trait is fairly common. It's common enough where they were having conversations around whether or not you want to screen people before accepting them into the NFL for having sickle cell trait. And, is that discrimination or not? And so the resolution, I believe, was to go ahead and screen because everyone was doing it anyway. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's actually been settled. But yeah, so they would select out for people who have the trait and not allow them in the NFL, if it ever goes through. And so, but if you have that trait, if you're listening, if you are metabolically healthy, you're going to have fewer episodes of crises because your body is more able to handle the stresses and do the workarounds required when you have one abnormally functioning gene. So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but that just gives you an idea that there's lots of different things we're talking about when we talk about working. How does your metabolism help your bad genes? And even the worst case scenario of some of the most deadly genes, like the BRCA1 genes for breast cancer and ovarian cancer, there's still workarounds. So the healthier you are, the better your chance of avoiding cancer, even if it would seem to be completely, in your family everywhere, and you have the BRCA1 gene and lots of people who've died, you still can do better by getting your metabolism healthy.
Absolutely. That's very well said. And you go through that whole treatment in your book in such an eloquent way. Now, we share a deep appreciation for the work of Dr. Weston Price. And in your book, you share some of his findings in traditional populations. Can you highlight a few for folks listening in?
Yeah, so Dr. Weston Price was, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with him, so he was a dentist who lived in the 1930s, and his brilliant idea, was to look for healthy people and find out what they're eating to serve as a control to give recommendations back in the States, because he noticed that there were lots of crooked teeth, and he just didn't think it was nature's plan, right, to have people have crooked teeth when no other animal species did. So he hypothesized that there were healthier people elsewhere, and he was correct. So he traveled around, to 11 different countries, finding healthy people who'd been isolated from civilization and continued their traditional food ways. And so what he found was people had straight teeth. And so he was correct. But the other thing that he found, and what we write about in the chapter that where we discuss beauty, right? It's dynamic symmetry is the name of the chapter, and it describes this geometric principle that underlies the growth of healthy people, and beauty actually is the result of growing according to that geometric principle. So it's not just hypothetical. It's something that we feel very strongly, respond emotionally very strongly when we see it, because it's something very, very important to nature. And what it means is that if you see a beautiful person and, they do have this geometry, which is generally why we perceive them as beautiful, maybe not just in their face, but generally throughout their whole body. So they tend to have like a long, graceful neck and a long waist, and very shapely if they're women, very broad shoulders, or big chests if they're men, long, graceful legs, all these sort of things. So this also, by the way, is what athletes tend to have, because they are built in general according to this design, or they would not be able to be athletes. So this is what Dr. Price found everywhere he went, and it's something that you don't have to have any kind of understanding of geometry or genetics to recognize. Nature builds it into our psychology so that we emotionally love looking at people who are beautiful. That's why they're movie stars. That's why we like watching sports, partly. So because we're seeing poetry in motion, essentially.
For sure.
So that is kind of the metaphysical part of what happens when generation after generation you have fed your genes with what they require to function optimally. That is kind of one of the most fascinating things that my husband and my co-writer Luke and I discovered when we were doing the research for this book. So we put it right in the first part of the book.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I mean I was amazed as well. Today's RDAs are obviously quite arbitrary, and you review Dr. Price's findings in terms of nutrients, and it's quite stark contrast to today's RDAs. Can you touch base on that?
So yeah, Weston Price, when he went everywhere that he went, he took back some food to analyze in his lab, and when he did, he found that the nutrient content, for example, of the cheese from Switzerland had in many cases 10 to 50 times the concentration of a variety of vitamins and minerals as the same cheese on the store shelf, where he was comparing to what people in America would be eating. And the reason for this is very important. So it was not just the cheese. It was like so many things that they did. Like their rye, right, that they made bread out of. The same story, had so many more minerals and was so much more rich in nutrients than the rye bread in the United States. The reason for this is because in these traditional cultures, it's not just what they eat. It's also, they start with the soil. They start with the environment they live in. They fortify the soil. They do like, we call it kind of like biodynamic is the closest thing that people might have heard of. It's way beyond organic, right? You're keeping the soil, the organism of the soil. You're considering the probiotics of the soil and everything like that. So that the food that you get is as bioconcentrated in all of that good stuff that's ultimately coming from the soil as humanly possible, as nature could possibly make it. And so the food is so much more healthy, and that's why when you look at what he describes people eat, in some cases it seems very repetitive. Like, for example, in Switzerland, there were times where they really were eating basically cow products and rye bread and maybe some stuff that they would hunt and a few things that they would grow in their garden, but primarily it was living off of cow and rye for good portions of the year. And that was enough because they paid such attention to the soil, and those foods were superfoods. So we like to talk about superfoods, right? And these were beyond, what anything that now in the store is sold as a superfood in terms of value, because they started with the soil. So that's why we emphasize source, and it's so important the best we can do in this country is get grass-fed. And so, that's why we strongly recommend getting any kind of animal product, particularly dairy products where the cows have been grass-fed instead of fed grain and soy.
Yeah, it's incredible how, trying to large corporations trying to take that food chain and just commodifying everything. We've gotten away from a lot of those traditional roots, which you just described, with massive impacts on nutrient density of the food. And of course, in your book, in the last 100 years, you mentioned how things have dramatically changed in terms of our food consumption, and of course, vegetable oil intake being one of those things that's dramatically on the rise. And of course, with some significantly negative impacts. Can you list a few of the ways that vegetable oils negatively impact health?
Yeah, so vegetable oils like corn oil, canola oil, soy oil, those are three big ones. I like to call them liquid death.
Nice, that's a good, clear way. Fantastic.
Because if you had like a Geiger counter of how damaging these things will be to your cellular function, even to your DNA, that you could walk down the grocery aisle with. You'd be walking through the grocery store, on the edges of the store, it would be pretty quiet, background radiation. But you would get to where the chips are sold, and tater tots, and pastries, and salad dressing, and that Geiger counter would be screaming at you, because when you eat foods that are high in vegetable oils, the vegetable oils break down in ways that lead to something very much like radiation. So it's called a free radical cascade, and it's free radicals are high energy molecules that fly around randomly in your cell and just destroy whatever they bash into at an extremely rapid rate. So this is why vegetable oils are bad for us, because they wreak cellular havoc. I like to compare like a large French fry, like a sack of those large French fries you might get from a fast food joint, to a pack of cigarettes in terms of the equivalent health damage, right? So it's not like your head's going to blow off immediately when you have a pack of fries. Your head's not going to blow off immediately when you when you smoke a pack of cigarettes. But you smoke enough, you have enough French fries, you have enough of those vegetable oils over years, you're going to get some kind of sickness. And I actually have done some math and figured out that the vegetable oil is actually worse than cigarettes because of the way that it impacts our antioxidant systems. And vegetable oil has a more powerful effect. And that's why we see effects of vegetable oil in just about everybody eventually who eats it. And the more they've gotten from childhood, the sooner you're going to see an impact. And so this is why now there's I think something like 25% of children are overweight, and many children now are developing diabetes and having heart attacks and strokes and developing complications of diabetes and having kidney failure, neurological problems.
That's staggering, isn't it?
Exactly, the children. So we used to think this type 2 diabetes was something that only older people got. But that was because their diet...
Adult onset diabetes, right? And we had to change the name.
Yeah, so it's oxidative stress is aging these children. And
you talk about the dietary-induced arterial aging. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so we talk about cholesterol clogging arteries and saturated fat clogging arteries because that's what doctors are taught. That's what the idea that came out of the 1950s was that it's a puritanical idea that enjoyable foods are sinful, and if fat is indulgent and is going to, it's sinful and evil and it's going to make you sick. And it was not a scientific thought at the time. It was never supported by science. However, it was promoted as if it were supported by science. And I talk about how that happened in the book, why we thought there was science when there wasn't. So it's not like we've gone back and forth. It's not like the science has gone back and forth. The science that you've heard has gone back and forth.
For sure.
That's really a spin. And so what happens is when you have a lot of vegetable oil in your diet and sugar, the two of them combine to damage the particles that carry lipoproteins, that carry the fat in your blood. They damage these particles, so the particles can't carry fat, and they don't last very long. And instead of being able to deliver fat, they fail, and they basically fail by dropping out of circulation and splat-lining on the edge of your artery. And over time, you get a lot of that. You build up into an arteriosclerotic plaque, and you can get heart attacks, strokes, intermittent claudication, all kinds of vascular disease. It can promote aneurysms, so that's what really causes heart attacks and strokes, not cholesterol and eggs and butter.
Yeah, you go through the Ansel Keys and the diet heart hypothesis so well, and of course, vegetable oils lowering LDL cholesterol is one of the reasons why, as you mentioned in the spin, is often one of the things cited as a reason to be taking them. But you also cover some, better markers for cardiovascular disease health in terms of triglycerides, HDL. Can you talk about some of the, better markers that folks could be paying attention to for their heart health?
Yeah, so in terms of blood test results, when you get your lipid panel, it's what I look at is the triglyceride to HDL ratio, and it's not just me; it's most doctors now who practice low carb or low carb LCHF, low carb healthy fat, and we the other two numbers there are your total cholesterol and your LDL cholesterol, and those are the two numbers that the drug companies want doctors to pay attention to because they've got a product that will impact those two numbers, but the doctors who practice low carb, we don't pay much attention to those at all. I don't pay any attention to the total cholesterol. And I only pay attention to the LDL cholesterol, which is what they call bad cholesterol. Unless it's over 190, then I'll, talk about family history and see if there's a family history. Possibly somebody has something called familial hyperlipidemia. But the other two numbers, triglycerides, are the total amounts of fats that come from your diet primarily, that are in your blood, or they can even come from your own fat cells in some cases. But the HDL is the so-called good cholesterol, and if you take your triglyceride number and divide it by the HDL number, and you come out with a number that's greater than 2.5, that's a problem, and it means that your body is not handling the amount of fat in your blood very well, and it's probably in the process of promoting arterial disease.
And too much sugar has a massive impact on LDL as well, correct?
Yeah, so both sugar and vegetable oil work together to cause oxidative stress. So it's like a 1-2 punch. Both of them are bad, but together they're really bad. And so one of the great things about the low-carb diet is that not only do you cut your sugar, but without even knowing what vegetable oils are, you're cutting them out. Because when you go low-carb, you don't just cut out sugar like soda and candy, and often a lot of fruit. Americans eat a lot too much fruit in general, but the other thing you cut out is the junk food that are full of starchy flours and potatoes and vegetable oils. So going low carb is beneficial not just because you're cutting carbs and reducing your insulin, but also because you tend to drastically reduce these vegetable oils, and that will drastically improve your cholesterol numbers. And in many cases, when people have gone low carb and they don't see those improvements, it's because for whatever reason they're still getting vegetable oils, and like maybe they go out to eat a lot and they're not eating carb, but they're eating meats and vegetables that have been fried in those oils.
Absolutely. And you talk about sugar, working with Canada basketball and NBA players, and I'm sure you've seen this as well. Some guys can be consuming a heck of a lot more sugar than you would think, and sort of getting away with it seemingly on the outside. Can you talk about your experience with that, sort of sugarholics, and whether athletes or professional NBA players, etc.?
Yeah, exactly. So sugar is promoted by the sports nutritionists, not in the form of candy, but in the form of fruit and fruit juice. They are promoting sugar, and athletes can get away with eating a lot of sugar for a while because they don't get fat, because they are burning off the calories. But on the inside, that sugar is kind of corroding them, and their metabolism is kind of getting weaker and wearing away. And so when I look at the blood test results of athletes who maybe have just 8% body fat, if they're eating a lot of candy very often, you can see not just the fasting blood sugar getting high, which is above 90, but also their triglycerides are high and their liver functions are high. And so the other thing is that they don't feel as good as they used to, right? When that starts to happen, it doesn't happen usually when they're 17 or even when they're 24, but often by the late 20s, because athletes are genetically gifted, right? They've got what we call genetic momentum, and they can get away with bad diets, not just because they're exercising, but also because of that genetic momentum. So they can get away with it for longer. But usually even these, people with fantastic genes, by their late 20s, they'll have some kind of an issue, and they'll think, oh, I'm just getting older. But no, well, I mean, yes, you've been aging your metabolism. You've been aging yourself metabolically, but you can reverse all that by becoming a better fat burner. And to do that, you have to cut the carbs back and get the right kinds of fats in your diet, get those vegetable oils out.
100%, and I know therapists and things will see that as well in terms of tissue quality and whatnot. And certain athletes, again, as you mentioned, as they get older, and all of a sudden these high sugar diets and the tissue quality and joint movement's not nearly as nice as it used to be. And of course, in your book, you mentioned the 4 pillars of the human diet. You outline the optimal human diet, and one of which is meat cooked on the bone. Can you talk about the benefits of slow cooking meats?
Yeah, so you just get the chicken with the skin on, include the bones, Or you could use like ribs is a kind of slow cooking. You can slow cook it in a slow cooker. You can slow cook it in a barbecue or in a low oven. But what you're doing is a lot of good stuff. You're not overcooking it. That makes the proteins more bioavailable. You're getting healthy fats because also the fat helps to keep you from overcooking it. But the most special thing of all is that you're getting very important molecules called glycosaminoglycans and hyaluronic acid and other special molecules that are missing food group from the American food chain right now, that are part of every traditional culture, that have benefits to our connective tissue. And so like I'm talking about like beef stock or bone stock, and it's derived from boiling the joint material. So like when you have a chicken and there's all that, you're eating gnawing down on the leg, that's shiny white stuff at the end, that's the collagen. The collagen and the cartilage get broken down when you boil them for a long time into nutrients that have a growth factor like effect, and that's why our body needs them, because they stimulate the activity. It's like taking hormones, but they're totally legal.
For sure.
They stimulate the activity of these cells called fibroblasts that make collagen. And athletes, whether they know it or not, their career longevity depends on the health of their collagen, because collagen is what their joints are made out of and their bones are made out of. And the number one reason for, a foreshortened athletic career is some kind of joint problem. So getting chicken stock or beef stock, or eating skin with chicken with the skin on like rotisserie chicken, or even like pork rinds, sort of, they've kind of been overcooked to death, but even the skin, in pork rinds has this collagen, and that will help extend an athlete's career.
It's incredible, as you mentioned in the book. And for myself, after university, I did a lot of traveling in South America and Asia and Africa and places. And of course, everywhere you went, people were, as you mentioned in the book, cooking the entire animal and using the juices and the liquids, and of course, getting all these incredible nutrients. And you mentioned in your book as well, organ meats as another nutritional powerhouse. And something that's not so common anymore. I remember eating liver growing up. I'm not sure if families these days are eating as much as we used to. Why are organ meats so beneficial for us, and what the heck happened in America? Why are we eating so few now?
Yeah, so the Lakers do love their chicken stock and their beef stock, but I have not had any luck. Well, actually, I haven't really tried that hard to get them to eat things like liver and other organs. So they're so beneficial because what they have is a lot of them different. They have a different nutritional profile than just muscle meat. And so, like right now, we just process the animal, and because the liver and the kidney and the brain, even the things like the trachea and the lungs, people used to eat all that stuff because they go bad really quick. It's not even part of the food supply anymore. We don't preserve it, we don't freeze much of it, and we don't know how to cook it. And the main reason really is that people don't know how to cook it. They don't want to cook it. If people would start wanting to cook it, we could bring it back. Then there would be a market for it. But the main reason is that we've not been told that these things are also essential and missing food group from the American food chain. And I mentioned just a minute ago that they have a different nutritional profile than muscle, right? So muscle meats from any animals are very high in protein, and red meat has some iron, and pork products have some B vitamins. But the organs each concentrate a different profile of nutrients, so they have loads more of different vitamins and minerals than what meat has. And in order to get the full spectrum rainbow of nutrients that we need, we have to eat the full spectrum of carnivores or omnivores. We don't just have to eat meat to be an omnivore. We have to eat all different parts of the animal. Really, that's what all other omnivores do. Mm-hmm. And we're not doing that. And so it's just like we're just getting a small sliver of the nutritional spectrum. And nutritionists like to talk about eating your color rainbow of vegetables. Well, the same applies to different organs of an animal's body. They each have their own special nutritional value.
And it's incredible because when you go to the butcher shop, the organ meats are actually typically the cheapest cut of meat out there, and the most nutrient dense. So we really just have to convince everyone. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just a matter of having people figure out what to do with them and how to make them taste good. Because we don't grow up even eating liver, and it's if we don't get a food or a flavor in childhood, it's not easy. Not very many people are able to process. It's kind of like you've heard of super tasters. These are people who actually enjoy new flavors, and their brains can process them better as well. But after a while, some people's brains just don't process new taste information. It's like learning a language. And so if you haven't grown up eating something, you may not ever really like it. But I do in my book go over how to do the best that you can to cross that barrier, to start liking foods that you don't like because they're good for you and you want to enjoy them. So, there is a way, but you have to follow the process.
You got to jump in, right? Well, you dive into some brain-building foods as well, one of which is, the amino acid cysteine. Can you talk about why that's so crucial for optimal brain health?
Yeah, so cysteine is an amino acid that is essential to one of our most important antioxidant enzyme systems. So when we talk about antioxidants, we're talking about fighting the aging process, fighting free radicals, fighting oxidation, fighting inflammation. And a lot of folks don't realize that our body has enzyme systems that are the front line of defense against oxidation. So these are antioxidants that the body makes, and it makes them. Enzymes are made out of proteins, and so one of the antioxidant enzyme systems requires cysteine, and it's you've probably heard of glutathione. It's because this enzyme system uses glutathione, and it's present in a lot of tissues in your body, especially in the liver. And cysteine is an essential amino acid. Our body can't make it, so we do need to eat it. So that's why I list in the book several of the great sources out there in the natural world of this very important amino acid.
Terrific. Well, so many great insights in the book. Definitely want to respect your time here. So if we shift gears a little bit, can we get some insights about yourself in terms of your morning routine? Are you a coffee drinker? How do you start your day?
Yeah, I do drink coffee. Like I never did until I went to Thailand, and I totally got hooked on their Dunkin' Donuts. They had this Thai iced coffee, and it was loaded with sugar, but it was so good. That's when I got hooked in medical school, and gradually I got myself off the sugar. Now I just have coffee that I've cold brewed on the counter overnight. In the morning, I just dump it through a filter, so it's more instant than instant. Back in the days of instant coffee, which I don't think people even know what that is anymore, but
so true.
Close. And then I pour in about a cup or a cup and a half of raw milk from grass-fed cows that I get from a store here in Connecticut. Very hard to find raw milk, but it's worth it. And then I also use cream that's also from grass-fed cows, and I put in probably about maybe close to a quarter cup, and that holds me for the whole day. So
fantastic.
I'm not hungry at all.
Yeah, we've got so many people up here in Canada, the Tim Hortons double, which is 2 cream, 2 sugar. So I like your insights there that you were able to get off of the sugar. So good piece of advice for a lot of our listeners that this is definitely possible. Now, last thing here before we let you go, just that sort of 30,000 foot view. If you could go back 10 years and give yourself some advice, what would it be?
Don't do primary care medicine. Gosh, I don't know. I guess it would have to do something other than primary care medicine. It's so inefficient in terms of getting this kind of information. I'd probably go back and get a public health degree.
It's someone on the front lines, and your work's so inspiring. It is so true that it just moves so slowly, doesn't it? It's like turning an aircraft carrier or something that these insights and all the things that you write about in your book take so long to really implement into day-to-day clinical work for the vast majority, right?
Yeah, and 10 years for me is like, I'm still old at that point. So I'd have to go back like 30 years to make a real difference.
Listen, I really appreciate you coming on the show. A huge fan of your work. Your new book, Deep Nutrition, is phenomenal. Where can people pick up the book, and where can people stay connected with you on Twitter and social media?
Oh, great question. So drcate.com is my website, and that's drcate.com. And there's no dot after the R, and it's Cate with a C. And my website will direct